Welcome back, class. We're going to talk 1900 to 1949. I'm going to go through this real quick because I doubt you want to hear me yammer for too long. You just want to TLDR this, I bet. Too long didn't read, in case you don't know what that means. So, going to start the 1900s with Arnold Schoenberg. He's a classical musician who took the complexity of the 1800s when we started featuring a lot more chromatic notes, and he pushed it into a big new direction that's known as atonal music, where basically there's no key center. It doesn't sound major or minor. Instead, it sounds very like haunting almost, kind of weird sounding. So the piece I included is A Survivor from Warsaw. I think Schoenberg wrote this during World War II. So, of course, different period of existential dread than nowadays, but certainly the horror carries in the music. So let me just play the first little bit of the song. Wait for it. If that isn't anxiety-inducing, I don't know what is. Actually, maybe this piece, The Firebird, by Igor Stravinsky, who was a Russian composer who wrote this ballet in 1910. And people walked out and said it was trash. And then like 3 years later, they said, this is brilliant, this is genius. Because it was like atonal a little bit, and it was when classical music was starting to get a little weird. Because they started to push the boundaries of harmonic chords and progressions. So here is The Firebird. Kind of on the quiet side, but I included a link. Features all the current instruments that we have nowadays. Still have an orchestra, but it's not as like bright and tuneful as the Beethoven days would have been. Instead, it's a lot more atonal and meant to sound more whimsical, I guess. But if that's not anxiety-inducing enough, I got one more for you. This is a guy named Wysyn-Grodzki, I believe, Ivan Wysyn-Grodzki. He wrote this piece of music that it can't be played on this piano, because this piano features the half steps via the chromatic scale. But what if you can go between the half steps? What if there's a note between C and C sharp? Well, that would be a C half sharp. Or a note between E and F would be an E half sharp, I believe. It's a weird, complicated system. If this is too complicated for you, just take a listen to it and you'll be like, wow, this is weird. I've never heard anything like it. And I recommend checking out the comment section. It says, I think your piano is clinically depressed. It's like hearing the taste of salt and vinegar chips. So people certainly love the sound of this song. This is 24 Preludes in quarter tones. Sounds almost like an out-of-tune piano, but it's deliberately out-of-tuned. Fun, right? Let's get away from those, though, because by the 1900s, we started having new technology that changed the world forever. Just like in the 1800s, we have piano, which really changed composition, as well as the saxophone, which was invented by Adolph Sax and worked its way into marching bands and the orchestra. We also have now electronic technology to record. Like I'm able to do this right now on my phone. About 100 years ago, it was a huge deal that we could record for the first time. So it was invented by our boy Thomas Edison. He invented the phonograph. We actually have a recording on YouTube I included of the very first recording by Thomas Edison.
The first voice I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
So yeah, sound quality is horrible, but it was the late 1800s, and it gradually got better over time. By the early 1900s, our early recording studios would have been, like let's say this was the room of the recording studio. They would have to space all the musicians out, like have the drums in the back and the quietest instruments up front so they could pick up all of the instruments. Later on, it changed to record each individual instrument individually. They call that tracks. hence the name 8-track, but early on it was all recorded at the same time. Now, pop music in the early 1900s had grown a little bit from the early classical songs. It was a lot more accessible. It was very basic melodies at first. At first, it was a little more basic melodies, kind of hokey for some of them. Here's an example, Bicycle Built for Two. This is sung by Nat King Cole. One, two, three, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is in a waltz feel. So that's Nat King Cole, The Bicycle Built for Two. We also have, because we have mass printing, we have a lot of machines that can print a lot of sheet music. We had a whole industry on people writing songs and getting the sheet music published. And one of the first mega hits that was published via sheet music was a song called After the Ball, which was in the late 1800s. Sold over 1 million copies, interestingly. And it was just one of those songs that everyone could sing. Wasn't the most complex song. Told a pretty basic love story. Sounds like this. And so on. The sound quality is pretty bad. This is again in 3/4. It features violins, a singer, probably a piano. Anyway, I recommend you check that out and listen to it. Another bit of technology from the early 1900s is the player piano. So people like me were out of a business for a little bit, as they had pianos that could basically play anything. And what was really popular in the early 1900s was ragtime. You probably think of that from songs such as The Entertainer, which is not exactly even eighths like previous music was. Again, classical music would have been very even. By the 1900s, we have a lot more of a backbeat. We have the march feel, which is the dun 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 feel. And the term ragtime comes from ragged time, because you can play the song perfectly even, or a little bit more uneven. Now that style would have come out a little bit later, being very heavy backbeat, but you can go, there's a lot of range between being very even eighths and very swung eighths, hence ragged time. Now we have an example of a 1915 player piano playing Maple Leaf Rag. And so on. So we got a lot more piano music. Player pianos were popular in the early 1900s, but they came to a crash in 1929 during the stock market crash. That's when a lot of those piano players, the player pianos, kind of just fell by the wayside as we shifted styles a little bit. Now, of course, during the early 1900s, one of the bigger moments was World War I, when the United States declared war on the Axis powers. Ooh, I should know that. I think it was Axis powers. Germany, Triple Entente, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. So, of course, there were songs written to get America ready for it. One of the songs you've probably heard in your history class is called Over There. And it's just very, it's almost like a march, but it's meant to be a fun little way of like, oh yeah, let's send the soldiers over there to die. I'm going to skip on to the main part that you might have heard. And so on. So it's a big jingoistic song, bit of a propaganda song to get people to be excited about war, but There was also a counterpart to that song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, which is a similar style song, early 1900s. A lot of instruments. You have flutes, you have a bit of a jumpy feel going on. There's still a bit of a strong backbeat going on. Now, one of the main things that changed was around 1910s and 1920s, as a lot of African Americans from the former South moved up to the north, such as Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, what's called the Great Migration, and they would play styles of music that incorporated European harmonies with former African American, sometimes slave song or sometimes some spiritual songs, and combine those two styles to create what's called the blues. So I have an example here, Bessie Smith, Lost Your Head Blues, which is more a basic form of the song. It's no longer sonata form, which is our verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus style. Instead, it was more like, okay, here's 12 measures, and what kind of story can we tell in there? And there's going to be a lot of repetition going on, but it's a little bit more simplistic and a little bit more soulful. It's swung, and a trumpet, piano. Really popular in the blues songs were a couple things. Number one, like sliding between the notes. Bessie Smith sang, "I can ring a maybe." So not exactly on the notes, but sliding in between them a little bit. And after she sang her phrases, the trumpet echoed a little bit, which is known as call and response. So that's a common term that developed in the early jazz era, which we have later on now in pop music. It's become a lot more popular. But it wasn't as much one instrument does one thing, another instrument does the counterpart. Instead, it was featuring the vocalists with the instruments behind them as well. And we hear that in the first ever movie that has sound synchronized with the action of the movie. That is The Jazz Singer, which isn't as jazzy as some of the other blues songs, but I'll play you a little bit of that. So here again, the instruments in the background, you have some soulful singing in The Jazz Singer, but again, it's not quite as jazzy as someone like Cab Calloway, Minnie the Moocher. Big band, lots of instruments. And it features a showman, features a lot of instruments, horns, trumpets, and you might know the song by this part. In a second. Echo and response, call and response. So it's Minnie the Moocher. It features a lot of instruments. It features a lot of the blues scale, so singing kind of the notes in between, taking advantage of the voice not being perfectly on the pitch, but kind of in between those notes. We have Louis Armstrong. He became a very popular trumpeter and later on vocalist, and he recorded a song called Go Down Moses, which was formerly a spiritual song sung in the churches, but he redid it as his own version, make it a little bit more jazzy and pop as well.
Go down.
Lots of harmonies. This is the spiritual part.
Way down in Egypt, let my people go.
And then we have the backbeat come in a little bit later. So it was the 1920s and 30s, as I went on, we have a lot more jazz musicians come to the forefront, and that became the dominant art form in the country in the 1930s during the Great Depression, was swing music, big bands, having a lot of musicians playing together at the same time, basically have people dance their sorrows away. And you hear that in songs like Duke Ellington's Take the A Train. So you have a lot of instruments again in that song. You have Sing 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 by Benny Goodman, formerly used in the Chips Ahoy commercial. I don't think they use that anymore, but it's a popular song you might have heard before. That one. Bright, tuneful melodies that made you want to sing. We have that major difference by the time we get to World War II, we see how much jazz has come to influence the style. Because whereas over there was kind of bland and more like a march, by World War II we have Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, which features the swung eights, and we have tight harmony among the singers. Trumpet first. And so on. Recommend listening to that. We have a few epic pieces of music recorded during that era, including George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which features a prominent clarinet solo at the very beginning. Before the rest of the orchestra comes in. And that is a 17-minute piece. It's called Rhapsody, similar to Bohemian Rhapsody, because the Rhapsody style is a lot of different movements going on. And if you listen to Rhapsody in Blue, it'll feel like 20 different movements by the time you get to the end of the song. And just a few last bits about the jazz era. We have Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Still features a lot of the notes that are in the major scale, but it's still swung. It features a lot of instruments. And so on. And lastly, we had a brief period of time during World War II where they stopped recording music because of all the war supplies needed to go toward building tanks, building jets, and whatnot. By the time World War II ended, we have jazz musicians kind of pushing the envelope into a bold new direction. So no longer was it the big bands, which had largely stopped by the mid-1940s, and instead we have more jazz quartets or quintets. We have an example such as Donna Lee, which is kind of like how the classical music of the 1800s got a little too complex by the late 1800s. Same thing happened with the jazz era. The jazz era started in around the 1920s, became really popular in the 30s, but by the 40s it just got a little too weird for the public. And I'm just going to play a little bit of that to finish off this video. This is Donna Lee by Charlie Parker. Again, complicated piece, but by the 50s we get a brand new style of music that I'll talk about in the next video. Have a good one, class.